Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
From airport networks to systems embedded in aircraft, commercial aviation relies on an increasingly complex digital infrastructure. A new GAO review found shortcomings in how FAA and TSA coordinate responsibility for protecting that environment from cyber threats. Jennifer Franks, director of GAO's Center for Enhanced Cybersecurity, joins me now with the details. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really glad to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You have dug into aviation cybersecurity. That depends on a growing network of connected systems on the ground, in the aircraft, across federal departments. Was there anything that prompted this particular look?
Yeah, absolutely. So what prompted this mandate was the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024. And that act included a provision for GAO to go in and evaluate both the Federal Aviation Administration as well as the Transportation Security Administration's roles and responsibilities managing cybersecurity and specifically aviation cybersecurity.
The FAA and the TSA are supposed to work together here. As you began the examination, what did you find both about their respective roles and how well they actually are working together?
That's a very good question. So we found out that there are some deviances with how they are actually working and collaborating in this cybersecurity space. FAA has defined and clearly assigned roles and responsibilities for carrying out the agency's related goals and objectives in this space. But in the contrast, TSA has not. And with the lack of really defining and clarifying your roles and responsibilities, what it is we found is that we started to interview stakeholders from industry, including airlines and other industry-related groups. They were confused as well with TSA's role and responsibility and some of the guidance that was coming out. So helping to streamline that information was something that we were talking with the stakeholders very early on that could have been helpful for them in their environment.
Really interesting that you brought the industry into this conversation. If there's confusion out there between the TSA, the FAA, and the airlines themselves, what sort of risks does that pose for airline operations?
Lots of risk can be posed, not understanding the intended purpose of the functionality of a system, the interconnected agreements with the system. If you think about this aviation security and responsibly what TSA does, generally you're thinking about ground transportation and what's happening in the airports. But once a passenger gets on that airplane, and their airplane is set to back up from the gate and start to navigate its way through the concourse and to get into the air, there are a lot of interconnected systems and processes from what TSA is managing to what FAA is managing. And some of those very appropriate level of security systems and controls could have identified risk or maybe unidentified risk and threats to them if we're not properly assigning the roles and responsibilities and addressing those different security measures that need to be addressed.
The report identifies a number of findings around agency roles, as we've just been discussing, but also budgeting and strategy. Walk us through the findings and what might have been at the top of the priority list here.
Yes. So with the findings, first with our objectives, I will start there. Our objectives were really to hone in on the extent of their roles and responsibilities. But then the Authorization Act asked us to look at the budget request for the FAA and to just understand how they were managing cybersecurity funds. And from there, to the extent to where they were following their own cybersecurity related strategies to implement some of those roles and responsibilities and the implementation efforts and the continuous monitoring and just being better prepared for the adverse reactions should rather something occur. And what it is we were finding is a budget conversation in cybersecurity is very critical these days. You have to understand the ask and then what was appropriated and then how that money is spent. And what it is we were finding is from fiscal years 24 to 2026, FAA had requested between $42 million and $11 billion just on the management of cybersecurity and aviation controls. But what it is we were finding is that how they were managing the funds or just being a little bit less clear and transparent in the research and development areas was a bit of a concern. So we do have a recommendation for them to improve their transparency rather around the budget, because to understand how you're managing your information, how you're managing the tools and the services and the technology from an inception to a continual maintenance phase is critically important, because every year with cybersecurity, your budget does inflate with the variances of threats and risk that you have to assess. But we have to understand the what was and the what is so that we can estimate if you are appropriately aligning the resources as they should be.
Jennifer Franks is the director of GAO Center for Enhanced Cybersecurity. Jennifer, one of the other things you call out is the FAA's implementation and monitoring of its cybersecurity strategy. Where does that come into play here as you're assessing risks and reliability?
So that's a good question. So what it is we were finding was FAA had not fully implemented some of the objectives supporting its cybersecurity strategy and looking at the goals to really protect and defend its networks and systems. And what's inherently important is you can have a procedure or some guidance and guardrails in place to navigate the what is, but unless you fully implement all of the necessary controls, you're going to have gaps in your processing. So there were 7 objectives that FAA did outline that they needed to have support for in their cybersecurity efforts. But our assessment revealed that only 3 of the 7 were actually adhered to. And the 3 that were really adhered to were their efforts to improve cyber threat intelligence collection and the processing of capabilities. We're looking at improving capabilities for detection and mitigation of threats, which are very important because we want to be able to discern what's coming and how to protect, and then leveraging cybersecurity research and development. But what we found, which is where we end up having some recommendations, are we have to improve our cybersecurity monitoring and our detection and our response capabilities. We have to look at our privileged user controls, those access controls of who can access these systems and how often, and are they actually performing the services that they need to be performing when. So getting into more of those zero trust architecture principles that really help us to refine some of the security controls that are needed to enhance the environment was really critical. In that area, we made a recommendation.
You've been talking primarily about findings here with the FAA. Did TSA just ace the test, or were there some issues that you found with them as well?
Definitely did not ace the test, and they do have one recommendation. And it really does stem from working with the stakeholders and understanding more of how cybersecurity is managed between TSA and FAA. So their recommendation, it was just one, it was primarily centered around that cybersecurity roadmap, where they really need to clearly define their roles and responsibilities for the entities that are responsible for carrying out aviation cybersecurity, and then really looking to share that information with the pertinent stakeholders so that they know the responsibilities that TSA does provide.
Jennifer, of those 5 recommendations, the agencies agreed with all of them, which doesn't always happen on a GSA report. But with that kind of alignment, what do you hope then that Congress takes from this in terms of policy direction and guidance? Because again, you're dealing with really important to agencies, but they do cross departments, and that makes this collaboration even more complicated.
It's very complicated. And one of the shining spots right now is that no threat has happened that mounted itself into a major event, a major cyber threat that impacted air traffic control or even ground transportation, that bridges that collaboration between TSA and FAA. But we have to stay ready to get ready. We don't know when, if, and how that vulnerability can occur. And if you're looking at some of our recommendations and thinking about what Congress can do next, because this was a part of an authorization act, so this legislation came from Congress, we have to stay on the cutting edge of making sure that they implement these recommendations. And yes, we went in and did a subset review of some of the systems in these areas, but holistically in their environment for managing and navigating all of the aircraft that is traveling across the globe, we need to be responsible for making sure that the configuration baseline of their agency is implementing these recommendations throughout, so that if something occurs, we have the utmost sophisticated controls in place to perhaps prevent something catastrophically from occurring.
Jennifer Franks is the director of the GAO Center for Enhanced Cybersecurity. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate you for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.